The cold had teeth. It bit through leather and wool and the seams of an old man's quiet life. Ezra Cole moved the way winter makes men move, carefully, like anything could crack and vanish into whiteness. The corrals creaked low under a lace of hoarfrost. Snow lay in the furrows, thin but stubborn, like a vow that hadn't yet decided if it would be kept. He was carrying ash from the stove when he saw the shape at the far fence. Small at first, only a darker knot against the pallor of morning. Then a darker knot within that knot, something tucked against a chest. He set the ash bucket down. The sound it made on the step was dull and wrong. She was not from here. You can tell by the way a person stands in wind they have not learned. She held herself side on to the gusts, as if a little turn could hide her from the cold's eye. Cloth was wrapped across her shoulders, torn and retied until it made a sling. The sling held a sleeping weight. Only the child's fist showed, blue-veined and still. Ezra waited. It was a habit he'd learned from animals. Let the wild thing make the first move. The mare in the home pasture lifted her head, breathed steam, and watched too. The woman did not wave. She did not call. She simply stood with her hand on a post that was furred in ice, and her body shivered in a way that had no rhythm. He took the long way down, boots biting through the crust. He did not hurry. Running at a stranger turns fear into something with teeth. When he reached the gate, he unlatched it slow and stepped to the other side. The woman's eyes tracked him like glass marbles, bright, wide, and past the point of deciding anything. Her mouth moved. No sound came. Then, as if she remembered how, breath-shaped words. Bread. It wasn't a plea at first. It was a fact, the way sky is a fact. Bread, and the small body in the sling, and the frost that had settled into her hair like ash. Ezra did not speak. He set his hand against the top rail, felt the burn of cold through the glove, and measured the color of the child's lips. He had known winter's quiet, the kind that follows a house when a woman and a child are no longer in it. He had known it long enough to recognize the edge. She tried again. This time the word tore itself on the way out. Bread. Her free hand loosened from the post and lifted a little, as if it could show the shape of hunger in the air. The sling creaked. The child stirred, mouth seeking, then fell quiet. Ezra kept his silence. Silence had always been his truer language. He watched the way her knees trembled and then locked, the way her shoulders sagged and then forced themselves high. A wind came low across the flats and drove a sheet of powder along the fence line. It climbed her skirts and stuck, turning the fabric gray. She looked at him, then the way animals do when they sense the end of their choices. Something in her steadied. She pulled the knot of the sling higher, pressed her lips to the child's temple, and lifted her gaze. "Take him," she said. The words were careful, as if they might break. For bread. It was not the kind of bargain the law makes, or the kind the church will bless, but it was the kind winter understands. Ezra's jaw worked once. He reached to the gate latch and closed it again. The little click sounded like the start of a story he did not want and could not refuse. He stepped forward one pace, close enough to see how thin she'd worn herself. There were blue crescents beneath her eyes, a fever gloss in her skin. Her dress had been a better dress once. At the hem it had learned dust. At the shoulders it had learned weather. On her left forearm, just above the wrist, a narrow cut had reopened and gone again to scab. Ezra looked at the child. He looked back at the house. The slant porch, the red door he had painted because red makes a place seem more alive when snow takes the rest of the color away. A stove hissed in there. A kettle fussed. Wood stacked with the ends toward him waited for hands. He unbuttoned one glove with his teeth and held out the bare hand the way one offers salt to a skittish horse. Palm up, empty, with time in it. The woman did not give him the child. She held tighter, as if asking would mean losing more than hunger. Her mouth hardened. Please. The third word was a different thing, not a fact, not a bargain. It was a bell rung from the last beam of a broken bridge. Ezra nodded once. He did not take the child. He turned and walked up the rise toward the porch. Behind him he heard a sound that was half sob and half anger, like pain ashamed of itself. He didn't look back. He opened the red door and went inside and set his hands to work. Bread heel from the crock, jar of tallow from the shelf, a strip of jerked venison, a blanket from the foot of the bed. Each thing took its place in the crook of one arm. He stood for a breath by the stove, letting the heat hack at the numb in his fingers. Then he went out again. She hadn't moved. Her boots had sunk a little deeper. Snow clung to her lashes, melting and freezing and melting again. The child stirred, made a small, thirsty sound. Ezra held out the bread first. She didn't take it. Her eyes were not on the food. They were on his hands, on the fact that they were steady, that they did not reach for the child like a prize. Only when he set the heel on the top rail and broke it did she move. She ate as if the bread might bolt. Crumbs clung to the corner of her mouth. Ezra offered the tallow, the jerky, the blanket. She shook her head at the blanket. Her jaw said, "Not for me." He set it anyway on the rail. The wind flipped a corner and laid it against her sleeve. She didn't pull away. "You from the road camps?" he said at last. The sound of his own voice surprised him. It always did, after long days with only stock to talk to. She nodded once. "Road, then river, then nothing. Name?" She pressed her mouth flat, not a refusal, something like a confession, that she did not want to lie, and the truth might be too heavy to lift. Finally, "Mara." He nodded once. He meant the nod to say, "All right," it said more. The child woke fully, searching. Ezra's eyes went to the house again. A kettle, a cup, a roof that kept snow out of hair and lungs. He looked back to the woman who had offered away her own blood for a slice of bread and a little mercy. He stepped closer and set the blanket across her shoulders himself, slow enough that she could tell him no. She did not. Her breath caught when the wool touched her skin. He could feel the heat of her fever through the weave. "Come to the porch," he said. "Wind's worse here." She looked past him to the house, as if it were a story told to children. Her knees softened. The sling shifted. For a heartbeat, she leaned into the fence to keep the world from tilting. Ezra reached, not for the child, but for the woman's elbow, bone and tremor beneath cloth. His hand was large enough to be gentle. They took one step, then another. The snow squeaked under their weight. The mare in the pasture blew and stamped, impatient for hay. Above the eastern ridge, the sky had found a thin blue it could hold on to. On the porch, Ezra set the food down and opened the door with his boot. Warmth belled out, stove breath, pine pitch, the ghost of coffee. Mara stopped at the threshold. She turned so the wind could not find the child and stood exactly there, half in, half out, as if the choice itself could keep her upright. Ezra did not urge. He set a cup on the table, spooned hot water over leaves, and waited with his back to her. The waiting made a sound in the room, a kind of space you could stand in without being seen through. When he turned again, she had come 2 steps inside. Snow shed itself from her hair in shy, dark drops. She did not sit. Her body held the readiness of a deer at a creek, Ezra pointed at the chair. She shook her head. He did not ask twice. The child whimpered. Mara swayed him, soft, then stilled, then swayed again. Ezra took a breath so quiet it barely happened, and moved to the cupboard for a clean cloth, the little tin of sugar he almost never used. He damped the cloth, folded it, laid it near the stove to warm. "Bread," she said again, but the word had changed. Less a hunger now than a fear of the price of kindness. Ezra nodded. He cut another slice. He set it near her hand and stepped away. He did not touch the child. He did not ask the questions that would pile like drift against a person's mouth. Outside, wind ran along the fence rails and rattled the dry seed heads. Inside, the kettle breathed. A small, ordinary room held 3 lives like a palm holds water. He said nothing. Then he set a second cup on the table. And in that quiet, a different decision gathered itself like heat behind iron. The second cup sat untouched. Steam uncurled, climbed, vanished. Ezra didn't push it closer. He only set his own hand around his mug, though the heat hurt his cracked knuckles, and stood with his weight leaning into the table. Mara shifted from foot to foot, rocking the sling like a tide that could not quite find rhythm. The baby stirred. A small cry, muffled by cloth, stung the air. She pressed her lips to the child's brow, whispering sounds too soft to be words. Ezra watched her throat move, the way her shoulders slumped when the sound settled again. "Sit," he said at last. The word was plain. Not order, not kindness, just a word with space in it. Mara lowered herself into the chair like a stranger sitting in a church pew, slow, suspicious, half ready to rise again. Ezra poured broth from a pot into a tin cup. He slid it across the table. Her hand hovered before it touched the handle. When she drank, her whole body flinched as if the warmth itself might accuse her. She drank again. Again. Then bent her head so her hair fell across her face, hiding what her hunger looked like. Ezra turned back to the stove. He reached for the bread heel she'd left on the rail, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it by the door. Outside, he heard the mare pacing, hoof striking ice in short, angry bursts. He should have been hauling water, cutting kindling, fixing the sag in the shed door. Instead, he was standing in a kitchen with a woman who had tried to trade blood for bread. "Where's his father?" Ezra asked. Her spoon stopped halfway. She did not look up. The silence was its own kind of answer. She dipped again, slower, as if the weight of the question had spilled into the cup. Ezra nodded once. He didn't ask more. The child woke fully. His thin cry grew sharp, like wire. Mara untied the sling, lifted him, pressed him close. Ezra stepped into the next room and returned with a small jar, milk he'd traded last week for nails. He set it near without speaking. Mara's eyes flicked up, wide, then back down. She held the child tighter, as if milk could also be a snare. Ezra crouched by the stove, stirred the fire, watched the orange veins climb new wood. Behind him, the sound of the baby softened, swallowed by Mara's hum. It wasn't a tune, just a low current. Ezra knew the sound. His wife had hummed that way years back, when storms rattled the windows and their own boy woke crying. That boy's shoes still sat under the bed. Too small now for any living foot. He stayed crouched longer than he needed, staring into flame, because the memory felt like a nail he couldn't pull. When he rose, Mara was watching him. Her eyes were sharp again, no longer glassy. She had seen something she wasn't meant to. He looked away, poured himself another cup, swallowed it too hot, let the burn fill the silence. "You can stay the night," he said. Her shoulders stiffened. She shook her head. "No, just bread." Ezra glanced at the door. Beyond it, dusk was already climbing down the ridge, blue stacked over gray. Wind would turn harder. Snow would fall again before midnight. She knew it too. He could see it in the way her jaw tightened against her own fear. "You'll freeze," he said. She pressed her lips flat, pulled the sling close, and stood. Her legs trembled, but her voice was sharp. "One night turns to two. Two turns to—" She stopped. The baby fussed. She rocked him once, twice, as if the motion could end the thought. Ezra didn't argue. He moved to the door, lifted the wrapped bread, and placed it on the table between them. Her eyes burned at it like it was gold she couldn't touch. Her hand shook when she reached. The baby whimpered again. Ezra saw the tiny fist clench against the cloth. He heard the sharp, hollow rasp in the sound. That wasn't a hunger cry alone. It was weakness. Mara knew it too. Her lips trembled. She pushed the bread back across the table. "Take him," she whispered. "He'll die out there." Ezra stood very still. The only sound was the stove popping as pitch burned through. He looked at the child, at the bread, at the door where night pressed its shadow tight against the frame. His throat moved once, but no words came. Instead, he reached slowly, set the bread aside, and touched the sling strap. Not pulling, just resting his hand on the knot like a promise. Mara bowed her head, shaking, not from cold now, but from something heavier. Tears dripped onto the child's blanket. Ezra said nothing. He never did when the choice was already made. He walked to the small bed in the next room, dragged the quilt off, and laid it near the stove. He made a pallet, nothing more than boards and wool, but warmer than the road. Then he set another log on the fire. "Stay," he said. Mara didn't answer. She only stood, trembling, the child at her breast, eyes fixed on the flames as if they might decide for her. Ezra left her the silence to climb into. The wind found every crack in the cabin. It moaned through the seams, rattled the shutters, pressed its fist against the door. Ezra lay awake on the cot, eyes fixed on the rafters. Across the room, Mara curled on the pallet by the stove, the child tucked into her arms, his breath a soft rattle. He told himself he'd rise at first light, chop wood, check the stock, fix the fence where snow had bent it low. Yet he lay still, listening to the sound of another body breathing under his roof. It was a sound he had not heard in years. It unsettled him. It steadied him. Both at once. Near dawn, the baby woke crying. Not sharp this time, but thin and worn. Mara sat up, rocking, murmuring. Ezra watched her silhouette bend and sway, shadows of hair and cloth against the glow. He wanted to close his eyes, but instead he swung his legs off the cot and crossed the room. Without a word, he took the kettle from the hook, filled it with snow from the bucket by the door, and set it on the fire. The hiss covered the sound of the baby's cry for a moment. Mara glanced up at him. Her eyes were rimmed red, but steady. When the water steamed, he poured it into the small jar, mixed the milk, and set it beside her. Their hands touched when she reached. Just a brush. Still she flinched. He went back to the cot, lay down again, stared at the ceiling. The rafters had not moved, yet the cabin felt smaller. By midday the storm had thickened. Snow swept sideways, blinding the yard. Ezra trudged through it, axe on his shoulder, boots breaking crust. He split wood in short, hard strokes, breath pluming white. His arms burned, but he swung harder. The rhythm was safer than thought. When he carried the wood inside, Mara looked up from the chair by the stove. She had stripped the sling, wrapped the baby in Ezra's old quilt. The child's face was pale, lips faint blue. Mara's hands shook as she held him close. Ezra set the logs down. He crouched beside her, studying the baby. The breath came shallow, uneven. Not just hunger. Something deeper. Fever, Mara whispered through cracked lips. He won't last. Ezra's jaw tightened. He stood, rummaged through a shelf until he found a tin. Herbs his late wife had gathered years before. He brewed them in a pot, bitter steam filling the air. Mara held the baby while he spooned a little of the liquid between tiny lips. Most dribbled out, but some stayed. The boy coughed weakly, then settled again. Mara's tears spilled freely now. She didn't wipe them. She only rocked, murmuring words Ezra didn't know. They sounded like prayers, or curses, or both. Ezra sat back, rubbed his face with both hands. He had not asked for this. He had not asked for a woman with nothing, a child clinging to the edge of life, the kind of silence that cut deeper than words. Yet, here it was. That night, Mara dozed in the chair, the baby against her chest. Ezra tended the fire, feeding it slow, steady, careful not to let the flames drop. He glanced at her often. The hard lines of her face had softened in sleep, though shadows clung under her eyes. She looked younger and older, both at once. Ezra remembered his own wife in the same chair, years ago, rocking their boy. He remembered the cough that never broke, the grave dug shallow because the ground was frozen. He remembered the silence afterward, a silence that had never left. Now here was another child, wheezing through the night. Another woman bent low, begging the fire for mercy. And Ezra, again, sitting with his hands useless in his lap. He rose, walked to the door, opened it just enough to let the night air bite his skin. He stood there, breathing frost, staring at the snow. When he closed the door, Mara's eyes were on him. She had woken, silent, watching. Ezra met her gaze for a long moment. Then he spoke, voice low, rough. He'll live. He didn't know if it was truth or prayer. Maybe both. Mara nodded once, eyes wet, and bent her head back over the child. Ezra fed the fire again. The storm raged, but inside the cabin, for the first time in years, there were 3 hearts beating instead of 1. The storm eased by morning, though snow lay heavy across the yard. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life in the white silence. Ezra stepped outside, breath hanging in the air, boots crunching. He cleared a path to the barn with the shovel, shoulders aching, then checked the stock. The cattle stamped in their stalls, hungry but alive. He forked hay, rubbed frost from muzzles, whispered to them the way he always did. When he returned to the cabin, Mara was by the window, baby in her arms. She had braided her dark hair tight, though strands escaped around her face. Her eyes followed him as he shook the snow off his coat. He set a small sack on the table. Flour, nearly gone. She glanced at it, then back at him. Her lips pressed together. Ezra sat, rubbed his hands. Won't stretch long, he said quietly. Mara's gaze dropped to the baby. His skin had more color now, though his breath was still uneven. She touched his cheek, then lifted her chin, meeting Ezra's eyes. I can work. Ezra studied her. Thin wrists, hollow cheeks. Still, there was iron in her voice. He nodded once. By afternoon, the sky cleared. Sun glared on snow, blinding white. Ezra hitched the sled to his horse, loaded wood and pelts. Mara stood at the door with the baby, watching him go. In town, traders eyed him warily. He sold hides, bartered for beans, salt, flour. As coins clinked into his palm, he caught whispers. Strangers seen on the road, families leaving their homes, food short already though winter had just begun. He rode back heavy with supplies, the weight more than the horse pulled. When the cabin came into view, Smoke rising steady, something in his chest eased. Mara opened the door before he knocked. Her face was pale but expectant. She reached for the sack, but Ezra brushed her hand gently aside. "Rest," he said. She didn't argue. She only stepped back, letting him set the load on the table. The baby stirred in her arms, and Ezra caught himself looking too long at the way she cradled him, at the curve of her shoulders bent in care. He turned away, busying himself with the supplies. That night, they ate beans boiled with scraps of salt pork. Mara ate slow, careful, feeding the baby between bites. Ezra watched her hands, scarred, strong, steady. When the meal was done, Mara set the bowl aside. She studied Ezra for a long moment. "You could have turned us away," she said softly. Ezra stared into the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, hiding whatever lived there. "Could have," he answered. Nothing more. The silence stretched, filled only by the crack of wood. Mara lowered her gaze, whispering something in a language Ezra didn't know. Then she leaned back, eyes closing, the baby pressed against her chest. Ezra sat still, watching the fire until it blurred. Days passed. Snow melted, froze again, turned to ice on the roof. Ezra and Mara worked side by side, chopping, hauling, milking, mending. She carried the baby in the sling, moving with quiet determination. Once, when Ezra's axe slipped and bit his palm, Mara caught his hand without hesitation. She wrapped it in cloth, tight, firm. Their eyes met in the stillness. No words passed, but something heavier than speech settled between them. At night, Ezra lay on his cot, staring into the dark. He heard Mara's breathing across the room, soft, steady. He thought of his wife's voice, long gone, of the graves on the hill, of the way loneliness had filled every corner of his life. Now it shifted, crowded by new sounds, a baby's whimper, a woman's sigh, the creak of floorboards under someone else's weight. He told himself it was only shelter, only survival. But in the quiet hours, he knew better. One morning, Mara stood at the door with the baby, watching Ezra saddle the horse. She asked, almost in a whisper, "Why did you take us in?" Ezra paused, one hand on the reins. Snow glittered on his shoulders. He didn't look at her. "Because I couldn't not." Mara's eyes filled, though no tears fell. She nodded, turned away, and held the child closer. Ezra mounted and rode out, the words hanging between them like smoke that refused to fade. The thaw came late. Snow lingered in the hollows. Ice clung to the fence rails, but the river cracked open under sun. Ezra rode the valley line each morning, checking for washouts, listening to the rush of water that promised spring. When he returned, Mara was always at the cabin door. The baby had grown stronger. His cries were louder now, his hands restless, tugging at her hair. She had color in her cheeks again, though the lines of hunger still edged her face. Ezra watched them without meaning to. He caught himself staring too long at the way her smile bent when the boy grabbed her finger. He turned away quickly, burying himself in work. One evening, smoke rose over the ridge, too black, too thick. Ezra saddled fast, rifle strapped. Mara stood by the stove, eyes wide, the baby clutched close. "Stay in," Ezra said. She shook her head. "What is it?" "Don't know yet." He rode out, hooves pounding the thawing ground. The fire was no accident. A neighbor's barn smoldered, beams collapsing, men shouting as buckets passed. Ezra helped haul water, shoulders burning, clothes soaked with smoke. By dawn, the barn was ash. The family stood hollow-eyed in the yard, and Ezra gave them half his hay without being asked. When he returned home, soot still clinging to him, Mara waited at the fence. She stepped forward, touched his sleeve, left a smudge of ash on her fingers. Their eyes held. No words. Weeks passed. The land thawed. Work multiplied. Ezra plowed fields, fixed fences, mended roofs. Mara learned each task quick, the child on her hip. She hauled water, stacked wood, drove nails with sure hands. She never complained. At night, they shared quiet suppers. Sometimes her hum carried through the room, soft, soothing the boy. Ezra listened from his chair, the sound curling into him like warmth he hadn't known he missed. One night she spoke, her voice steady. "I meant it, you know. That first day, I would have traded him. For bread." Ezra looked at her across the firelight. She didn't flinch. "I know," he said. Her throat worked. "And you took both." Ezra leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. He stared into the flames, then at her. "Couldn't split them. Bread feeds a day. He feeds more." Mara's eyes filled. She pressed her lips to the baby's hair, rocking him though he slept. Spring deepened, the cabin yard filled with green shoots. Birds returned, loud in the mornings. The baby took his first steps across the floorboards, wobbling between Mara's hands and Ezra's boots. Ezra bent, caught him, lifted him high, his rough face breaking into something almost like a smile. Mara watched, her hands trembling against her apron. That night, after the boy slept, she lingered by the fire. Ezra was mending tack, his fingers slow, precise. "You never asked my name," she said quietly. Ezra looked up, his brow furrowed, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "Mara," she whispered. "His name's Eli." Ezra set the leather aside. He nodded once, repeating the names low, almost like prayer. Mara, Eli. The sound filled the cabin, fragile and solid both. The summer fields grew thick, fences held, the herd fattened. Ezra worked from dawn till dusk, but he no longer returned to an empty house. The boy's laugh carried across the yard. Mara's hum floated through the open door. At night, when the day's work lay finished, Ezra sat by the fire. Sometimes Mara sat near, Eli asleep between them. Their hands never touched, their eyes rarely held. Yet the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. One evening, Ezra stepped outside. The sun bled red across the horizon. Mara followed, Eli on her hip. They stood at the rail, the fields stretching wide before them. Mara turned to him, voice low. "You never said why." Ezra frowned. "Why what? Why you took us in? Why you didn't send us on?" Ezra studied the land, the sky, the rough edge of the hills. Then he looked at her. "Because I was empty," he said. "And now I'm not." Mara's breath caught. She bowed her head, pressed her cheek against Eli's hair. The boy stirred, sighed, settled again. Ezra reached out. His hand hovered, then rested gently on the child's back. For the first time, Mara didn't flinch. The sun sank. Shadows stretched long. 3 figures stood at the rail, close enough that the silence between them was no longer silence at all.